The roar of the motorcycle engine echoed through the quiet streets of Cedar Falls as Jake Martinez rolled into town. His black Harley-Davidson gleamed under the bright afternoon sun, chrome pipes catching the light like mirrors. Jake was 28 years old and looked every bit the tough guy he wanted people to think he was. His leather jacket was worn and weathered from years of riding across the country. Dark sunglasses covered his eyes, and his black hair was slicked back under a bandana. Jake had tattoos covering both his arms, telling stories of his travels and adventures. A skull with flames decorated his right shoulder, while a roaring tiger stretched across his left forearm. His hands gripped the handlebars with confidence, showing off rings on 3 of his fingers. Everything about Jake screamed danger and rebellion. He liked it that way. People moved out of his path when they saw him coming, and that made him feel powerful. The small town of Cedar Falls was nothing like the big cities Jake usually visited. Here, children played safely in front yards, while their mothers hung laundry on clotheslines. Old men sat on porches reading newspapers and waving at neighbors who walked by. White picket fences surrounded neat little houses with flower gardens in full bloom. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, and strangers were noticed immediately. Jake shook his head as he rode down Main Street. This place was too quiet, too peaceful, too boring for his taste. He preferred the noise and excitement of city life, where bars stayed open all night, and nobody asked questions about where you came from or where you were going. But he had a reason for being here, even though he did not want to admit it. His father, Robert Martins, lived alone in a small house on Maple Street. Jake had not seen his father in over 2 years, and their phone conversations were always short and awkward. The old man was 72 years old now, and Jake knew he should visit more often. But every time he thought about coming to Cedar Falls, something inside him resisted. His father was too soft, too kind, too willing to help others. It embarrassed Jake to have a father who was known around town as the nice guy who would do anything for anyone. Jake turned onto Maple Street and slowed his motorcycle as he looked for house number 47. The street was lined with small homes, each one carefully maintained with green lawns and colorful flowers. Children's bicycles lay scattered on driveways, and American flags hung from several porches. Everything looked perfect and peaceful, which only made Jake feel more out of place. Finally, he spotted his father's house. It was a modest white house with blue shutters and a small front porch. The lawn was neatly cut, and rose bushes grew along the front fence. Jake could see his father had been taking good care of the place, just like he always did. The old man took pride in keeping everything neat and tidy. As Jake parked his Harley in the driveway, the loud engine noise suddenly stopped, leaving the street in unusual quiet. He removed his helmet and sunglasses, running a hand through his dark hair. Just as he was about to walk toward the house, something in the yard next door caught his attention. There, moving slowly across the neighbor's lawn, was the strangest-looking dog Jake had ever seen. The animal was medium-sized but looked like it had been put together from parts of different dogs. Its fur was patchy and uneven, with brown spots mixed with white and black areas. One ear stood straight up, while the other flopped down completely. The dog's face had several scars running across it, and Jake could see that part of its tail was missing. But what really made Jake stare was the dog's eyes. They were 2 completely different colors. One was brown like chocolate, while the other was bright blue like the sky. The combination gave the animal an odd, almost comical appearance that made Jake laugh out loud. The dog stopped walking and turned to look at Jake. Instead of barking or running away, it just stood there with what looked like a friendly expression. Its stubby tail wagged slightly, and it tilted its head to one side, as if trying to figure out who this loud stranger was. Jake shook his head and laughed again. In all his years of traveling and seeing different places, he had never encountered such an ugly mutt. The poor thing looked like it had been through some serious troubles in its life. He wondered what kind of person would keep such a pathetic-looking animal as a pet. "What a joke," Jake muttered to himself as he grabbed his leather bag from the motorcycle. The dog continued to watch him with those strange, mismatched eyes. But Jake just turned away and headed toward his father's front door. He had more important things to worry about than some neighbor's ugly dog. Little did Jake know that this first encounter with the strange-looking animal would soon change everything he thought he knew about his father and about what really mattered in life. Jake knocked on his father's front door and waited. After a few moments, he heard slow footsteps approaching from inside the house. The door opened to reveal Robert Martinez, a thin man with gray hair and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. Despite being 72 years old, Robert still had a warm and welcoming presence that made people feel comfortable around him. "Jake, my son," Robert said softly, his face lighting up with genuine happiness. "I am so glad you came to visit me." Jake nodded stiffly and stepped inside the house. The living room was exactly as he remembered it from his childhood. Old family photos covered the walls, and his mother's favorite quilt still lay draped over the back of the sofa. Everything was clean and organized, just like his father always kept it. "How long can you stay this time?" Robert asked as he closed the door behind his son. "Just a few days," Jake replied, setting his bag down near the entrance. "I have business to take care of in the next state." Robert's smile faded slightly, but he did not say anything about Jake's short visit. Instead, he offered to make coffee and asked if his son was hungry after the long motorcycle ride. Jake accepted the coffee but said he was not interested in food. The truth was, being in his childhood home always made him feel uncomfortable and restless. As they sat in the living room drinking coffee, Jake found himself looking out the window toward the neighbor's yard. The strange-looking dog was still there, now lying under a large oak tree. Even from a distance, Jake could see how odd the animal looked with its mismatched features and patchy fur. "Dad, what is wrong with that dog next door?" Jake asked, pointing through the window. "It looks like it got hit by a truck or something." Robert turned to look where his son was pointing. When he saw the dog, his expression became gentle and thoughtful. "That is Rusty," he said quietly. "He belongs to Margaret Thompson, the lady who lives in the blue house." "Rusty," Jake repeated with a laugh. "More like rusty and broken. I have never seen such an ugly mutt in my entire life. Look at those crazy eyes and that chopped-off tail. The poor thing looks like a walking disaster." Robert frowned at his son's harsh words. "Jake, you should not judge an animal by how it looks on the outside. Rusty has been through difficult times, but he has a good heart." "A good heart," Jake scoffed. "Dad, it is just a dog, and not even a good-looking one. I cannot believe someone actually keeps that thing as a pet. It probably scares away all the other animals in the neighborhood." Jake continued to make jokes about the dog's appearance while his father listened in silence. He pointed out every flaw he could see, from the animal's limping walk to its scared face. In Jake's mind, the dog represented everything that was weak and pathetic about this small town. People here were too soft-hearted, keeping animals that should probably be put out of their misery. "The thing probably cannot even bark properly with a face like that," Jake said, laughing at his own joke. "I bet when it tries to scare away burglars, they just feel sorry for it instead." Robert set down his coffee cup and looked directly at his son. "Jake, that dog has more courage and loyalty than most people I have known. You might be surprised if you took the time to really see him." "Courage," Jake repeated mockingly. "Dad, you are getting soft in your old age. It is just an ugly stray that somebody felt sorry for. There is nothing special about it." The conversation moved on to other topics, but Jake kept glancing out the window at Rusty. Every time he looked, the dog seemed to be watching the house with those strange colored eyes. Sometimes Rusty would stand up and walk closer to the fence that separated the two properties, as if he was trying to see inside Robert's house. "Why does that dog keep staring over here?" Jake asked during a lull in their conversation. Robert looked out the window again and waved slightly at Rusty. To Jake's surprise, the dog's stubby tail began wagging, and he seemed to nod his head before trotting away toward the back of the neighbor's yard. "Did you just wave at that dog?" Jake asked in disbelief. "We are neighbors," Robert replied simply. "Neighbors should be friendly to each other." Jake shook his head in amazement. His father was even stranger than he remembered. Making friends with the neighborhood's ugliest dog was exactly the kind of thing that embarrassed Jake about his father. Robert was too kind, too willing to see good in everything and everyone. As the afternoon wore on, Jake noticed that his father seemed more tired than usual. Robert moved slower when he walked across the room, and he paused often to catch his breath. There were several prescription bottles on the kitchen counter that had not been there during Jake's last visit. "Are you feeling okay, Dad?" Jake asked reluctantly. "Just getting older, son," Robert replied with a smile. "Nothing that time and rest will not handle." Jake wanted to ask more questions about his father's health, but something held him back. Instead, he found himself looking out the window again at the strange dog named Rusty, wondering why such an ugly animal seemed to fascinate his father so much. The next morning, Jake woke up to the smell of bacon and eggs cooking in the kitchen. He had slept in his old bedroom, which his father had kept exactly the same since Jake moved out 15 years ago. His high school football trophies still sat on the dresser, and his old rock band posters still covered the walls. Being surrounded by memories of his teenage years made Jake feel trapped and restless. He walked into the kitchen wearing jeans and a black t-shirt, his hair still messy from sleep. Robert was standing at the stove, carefully flipping eggs in a cast iron pan. The old man was already fully dressed in clean clothes, his silver hair combed neatly. He had always been an early riser, even when Jake was young. "Good morning, son," Robert said cheerfully. "I made your favorite breakfast: scrambled eggs, crispy bacon, and wheat toast with butter." Jake sat down at the small kitchen table and poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot his father had prepared. "Thanks, Dad," he mumbled, though he felt uncomfortable with all the attention and care his father was showing him. As they ate breakfast together, Jake found himself growing more irritated with his father's gentle nature. Robert asked polite questions about Jake's travels and his motorcycle, but he never pushed for details when Jake gave short answers. The old man seemed genuinely interested in his son's life, even though Jake rarely called or visited. "I saw in the newspaper that there is a motorcycle show in the next county this weekend," Robert mentioned casually. "Maybe we could drive over and look at some of the bikes together." "I will probably be gone by then," Jake replied without looking up from his plate. "I told you I can only stay a few days." Robert nodded quietly and did not press the issue. His acceptance of Jake's rudeness only made Jake more frustrated. Why could his father not get angry or fight back like a normal person would? Why did he have to be so understanding and patient all the time? After breakfast, Jake stepped outside to smoke a cigarette on the front porch. The morning air was cool and fresh, and birds were singing in the trees that lined Maple Street. Children were already playing in their yards, and Jake could hear the sound of lawnmowers starting up as neighbors began their weekend chores. As Jake lit his cigarette, he noticed movement in the yard next door. Rusty had appeared near the fence line and was looking directly at Robert's house. The dog sat down and seemed to be waiting for something. Jake watched with curiosity, wondering what the strange animal was doing. A few minutes later, Robert came outside to water the flowers in his front garden. As soon as he appeared, Rusty stood up and walked closer to the fence. The dog's tail began wagging, and he made a soft whining sound that was almost like a greeting. "Good morning, Rusty," Robert called out gently. "How are you feeling today, old friend?" The dog's response amazed Jake. Rusty barked once, a short and happy sound, then sat down again and tilted his head to one side. It was as if he understood exactly what Robert had said and was trying to answer back. "Dad, are you seriously having a conversation with that mutt?" Jake asked with a laugh. "Animals are good listeners," Robert replied as he continued watering his roses. "Sometimes they understand more than people think they do." Jake shook his head in disbelief. His father was talking to the neighborhood's ugliest dog like it was his best friend. It was embarrassing and ridiculous. What would people think if they saw the old man chatting with a scared-up stray animal every morning? Hashtag Part 4. The Mysterious Connection. On Sunday morning, Jake woke up later than usual and found his father already in the kitchen, sitting by the window with a cup of coffee. Robert was looking out toward the neighbor's yard with a calm and peaceful expression on his face. The morning sunlight streamed through the clean glass, creating a warm glow around the old man as he watched something outside. Jake poured himself coffee and sat down at the table. "What are you staring at out there, Dad?" he asked, still feeling groggy from sleep. "Just enjoying the morning," Robert replied softly, not taking his eyes away from the window. Jake followed his father's gaze and saw Rusty standing near the fence line, exactly like he had been the day before. The dog was looking directly at the kitchen window, his mismatched eyes focused on Robert. It was as if the animal was waiting for something specific to happen. "That dog is out there again," Jake observed. "Does he do this every day?" Robert nodded slowly. "Every morning at 8:30, just like clockwork. He is very reliable." Jake watched as his father lifted his coffee cup slightly, almost like a small salute. Immediately, Rusty's stubby tail began wagging, and the dog took a few steps closer to the fence. Then, as if satisfied with what he had seen, Rusty turned and trotted away toward the back of Margaret's yard. "Dad, did you just signal to that dog?" Jake asked in amazement. "We have our routine," Robert explained simply. "It has become a nice way to start each day." Jake stared at his father in confusion. "What kind of routine?" "You wave at a dog every morning." "That is the strangest thing I have ever heard." Robert smiled but did not explain further. Instead, he got up from his chair and began preparing breakfast for both of them. Jake wanted to ask more questions about this weird daily ritual, but something in his father's manner suggested that the topic was closed for now. Throughout the day, Jake found himself thinking about the strange interaction between his father and Rusty. He could not understand why his father would care about communicating with a neighborhood dog, especially one that looked so rough and damaged. In Jake's world, people did not waste time on things that could not benefit them in some way. That evening, Jake decided to call his friend Tommy, who lived in Chicago and shared his love of motorcycles and the freedom of the road. Jake stepped outside to get better phone reception and stood in the driveway next to his Harley. "Tommy, you would not believe this crazy place," Jake said when his friend answered. "My old man has made friends with the ugliest dog you have ever seen. He sits by the window every morning and waves at this mutt like they are old buddies." Tommy laughed on the other end of the line. "Your dad always was a soft touch, Jake. Remember how he used to feed every stray cat in your neighborhood when you were a kid?" "This is different," Jake insisted. "It is like they have some kind of secret communication going on. The dog shows up at exactly the same time every day, and my dad acts like he is expecting him." As Jake talked on the phone, he noticed a light come on in Margaret's house next door. Through the window, he could see a woman in her 50s moving around her kitchen. She had gray hair pulled back in a ponytail and was wearing a simple blue dress. This must be Margaret Thompson, the owner of the strange dog. "I have got to go, Tommy," Jake said, ending the call. "I think I am going to introduce myself to the neighbor and find out what the deal is with this dog." Jake walked over to Margaret's front door and knocked. After a moment, the woman opened the door and looked at him with curious but friendly eyes. She was shorter than Jake had expected, with a kind face that reminded him of his elementary school teachers. "You must be Robert's son," Margaret said with a warm smile. "I have heard so much about you. I am Margaret Thompson." "Jake Martinez," he replied, shaking her hand. "I wanted to ask you about your dog. My father seems to have some kind of friendship with him." Margaret's expression became thoughtful and slightly emotional. "Rusty is very special," she said carefully. "He has been through a lot in his life, but he has the biggest heart of any animal I have ever known. My dad waves at him every morning," Jake explained. "I was just curious about why they seem to have this routine." Margaret looked toward Robert's house, then back at Jake. "Your father is a wonderful man," she said softly. "Rusty recognizes good people, and he has always been drawn to your dad. They understand each other in a way that is hard to explain." Jake wanted to ask more specific questions, but something in Margaret's tone suggested that there was more to the story than she was willing to share with a stranger. "Well, I just wanted to meet you and say hello," he said politely. "Please tell your father that I asked about him," Margaret replied. "And Jake, I hope you will give Rusty a chance. He might surprise you." As Jake walked back to his father's house, he felt more confused than ever. Everyone seemed to know something about this dog that he did not understand. His father had a daily routine with the animal, and Margaret spoke about Rusty like he was some kind of hero instead of just a damaged stray. Back inside the house, Jake found his father reading in the living room. "Dad, I just met Margaret Thompson," he said, sitting down on the sofa. "She seems to think very highly of you and that dog of hers." Robert looked up from his book with a pleased expression. "Margaret is a good neighbor. She has been very kind to me over the years." "She said Rusty recognizes good people," Jake continued. "What did she mean by that?" Robert was quiet for a long moment, as if he was deciding how much to reveal. "Some animals have special instincts about people," he finally said. "They can sense things that we might miss." Jake felt like his father was speaking in riddles. "Dad, I do not understand what you are talking about. It is just a dog. What is so special about him?" "Maybe someday you will see for yourself," Robert replied gently, returning to his book. That night, Jake lay in his old bed feeling frustrated and restless. There was clearly something important happening between his father and the neighborhood dog, but no one would give him a straight answer about what it was. He decided that tomorrow he would pay closer attention to this morning ritual and try to figure out what everyone was hiding from him. Monday morning arrived gray and cloudy, with heavy rain clouds gathering in the sky above Cedar Falls. Jake woke up around 7:30, planning to watch his father's strange morning routine with Rusty from his bedroom window. He wanted to understand what was really happening between the old man and the scared dog. But as Jake got dressed and prepared to spy on the daily ritual, he realized something was wrong. The house was completely silent. Usually by this time, he could hear his father moving around in the kitchen, making coffee and preparing for the day. The smell of brewing coffee should have been drifting down the hallway, but there was nothing. Jake walked to the kitchen and found it empty. The coffee maker was cold, and there were no signs that his father had been there at all. The morning newspaper still lay outside on the front porch, unopened and getting damp from the light rain. "Dad," Jake called out, his voice echoing through the quiet house. "Are you okay?" There was no response. Jake felt a small flutter of worry in his chest, but he tried to convince himself that his father was probably just sleeping late for once. Robert had seemed more tired than usual during the past few days, so maybe he was finally getting some extra rest. Jake made his own coffee and sat by the kitchen window, looking out at the neighbor's yard. Right on schedule at 8:30, Rusty appeared near the fence line. The dog looked toward the kitchen window and waited, his tail wagging slightly in anticipation of his daily greeting with Robert. But when no one appeared at the window, Rusty's behavior changed. The dog moved closer to the fence and began whining softly. He paced back and forth along the fence line, looking more and more agitated as the minutes passed. Something was clearly wrong, and the intelligent animal seemed to sense it. Jake watched this scene with growing unease. If his father always greeted the dog at exactly 8:30, then where was he now? Jake set down his coffee cup and decided to check on Robert directly. He walked down the hallway toward his father's bedroom, calling out again, "Dad, are you awake? Your dog friend is waiting for you outside." Still no answer. Jake knocked on his father's bedroom door and waited. When there was no response, he slowly opened the door and looked inside. The bed was empty but had been slept in. Robert was not there. Jake's worry turned to real concern as he searched the rest of the house. He checked the living room, the basement, and even the small back porch, where his father sometimes sat in the evenings. Robert was nowhere to be found, and there were no signs of where he might have gone. Finally, Jake approached the bathroom door, which was closed. He knocked and called out his father's name. When he still got no response, he tried the door handle and found it unlocked. Jake pushed the door open and felt his heart stop. His father was lying on the bathroom floor, unconscious and barely breathing. Robert's face was pale and covered with sweat, and his lips had a bluish tinge that terrified Jake. The old man's body was twisted at an awkward angle, as if he had collapsed suddenly while trying to reach for something. "Dad. Oh God, Dad." Jake dropped to his knees beside his father's still form. He had no medical training, but he could see that Robert was in serious trouble. Jake's hands shook as he felt for a pulse in his father's neck. It was there, but weak and irregular. Jake's tough guy persona disappeared completely as panic took over. His father, the gentleman who waved at dogs and grew roses and read gardening books, was lying unconscious on the cold bathroom floor. Jake had no idea how long Robert had been there or what had caused him to collapse. With trembling fingers, Jake pulled out his cell phone and dialed 911. When the emergency operator answered, Jake struggled to keep his voice steady as he gave the address and explained the situation. "My father is unconscious on the bathroom floor," Jake said, his voice cracking with emotion. "He is 72 years old, and he is barely breathing. Please send help right away." The operator asked Jake to check his father's breathing and pulse again, then guided him through some basic first aid steps while they waited for the ambulance to arrive. Jake followed the instructions as best he could, but he felt helpless and scared. His father looked so small and fragile lying there, nothing like the strong man who had raised him. Within minutes, Jake heard the sound of sirens approaching. The paramedics arrived quickly and took over the situation with professional efficiency. They checked Robert's vital signs, started an IV, and prepared him for transport to the hospital. "What happened to him?" Jake asked desperately as the paramedics worked. "It looks like he has had a heart attack," one of the paramedics explained. "We need to get him to the hospital immediately." "Are you his son?" Jake nodded, unable to speak as he watched the medical team carefully lift his father onto a stretcher. Robert's eyes were still closed, and he had not responded to any of the paramedics' attempts to wake him. As the ambulance pulled away from the house with its lights flashing and sirens wailing, Jake followed in his car. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he tried not to think about losing his father. All the years of distance and awkward conversations suddenly seemed so pointless and wasteful. At the hospital emergency room, Jake paced the waiting area while doctors worked to stabilize his father. A nurse eventually came out to speak with him, her expression serious but hopeful. "Your father has suffered a significant heart attack," she explained. "The doctors are doing everything they can, but his condition is critical. The next few hours will be very important." Jake sank into a plastic chair, feeling overwhelmed by fear and regret. If he had checked on his father earlier, would it have made a difference? How long had the old man been lying unconscious on that bathroom floor? As he sat in the sterile waiting room, Jake thought about Rusty pacing anxiously by the fence, somehow knowing that something was terribly wrong. For the first time, Jake began to understand that there might be more to the relationship between his father and that strange-looking dog than he had ever imagined. Jake had been sitting in the hospital waiting room for 3 hours when he saw a familiar figure walking through the automatic doors. Margaret Thompson looked worried and out of breath, as if she had hurried to get there. Her gray hair was pulled back hastily, and she was carrying a small purse clutched tightly in her hands. She spotted Jake immediately and walked over to where he was sitting. Her kind eyes were filled with concern as she approached him. "Jake, I came as soon as I heard," Margaret said, sitting down in the chair next to him. "How is your father doing?" "The doctors are still working on him," Jake replied, his voice tired and strained. "They said he had a major heart attack. I found him on the bathroom floor this morning." Margaret's face went pale at this news. "Oh my goodness, What time did you find him? Around 8:45, Jake answered. I was wondering why he had not gotten up for breakfast, so I went looking for him. Margaret's expression changed to one of understanding mixed with alarm. 8:45, she repeated slowly. That means he had been lying there for quite a while. Jake looked at her with confusion. What do you mean? How would you know when he collapsed? Margaret was quiet for a moment, as if she was deciding whether to share something important. Finally, she took a deep breath and turned to face Jake directly. Jake, there is something you need to know about Rusty and your father, she began carefully. Their relationship is not just a friendly morning greeting. It is much more important than that. I do not understand, Jake said, though he was beginning to suspect that this conversation would explain the mystery he had been puzzling over for days. 3 months ago, your father had a smaller heart episode while he was working in his garden, Margaret explained. He collapsed near his tomato plants and could not get up. He was conscious but too weak to call for help loudly enough for anyone to hear him. Jake felt his stomach tighten as he listened to this story. His father had never mentioned having any previous heart problems during their phone conversations. Margaret continued, I was inside my house making lunch when Rusty started barking frantically. It was not his normal bark. It was urgent and desperate, like he was trying to tell me something important was wrong. What happened next? Jake asked, though he was beginning to understand where this story was leading. Rusty ran to our back door and kept barking at me until I followed him outside, Margaret said. Then he led me straight to the fence line and kept barking toward your father's yard. I could see that something was wrong, so I climbed over the fence to check. Jake's eyes widened as he realized what Margaret was telling him. Rusty found my father. Yes, Margaret nodded. Your father was lying in his garden, conscious but unable to get up. He had been there for almost an hour, getting weaker and more frightened. If Rusty had not alerted me, your father might have died that day. Jake stared at Margaret in shock. The ugly, scared dog that he had been making fun of for 3 days had actually saved his father's life. All of Jake's cruel jokes about Rusty being worthless and pathetic suddenly felt horrible and shameful. After that day, Rusty appointed himself as your father's guardian, Margaret continued. Every morning at 8:30, he goes to the fence line and waits for your father to appear at the kitchen window. It is their signal that Robert is okay and able to start his day. That is why Dad waves at him, Jake said quietly, finally understanding the mysterious morning routine. Exactly, Margaret confirmed. If your father does not appear at the window by 8:35, Rusty knows something is wrong. This morning, when Robert did not show up, Rusty started barking and pacing immediately. I knew I should call to check on your father, but then I saw the ambulance arrive. Jake felt overwhelmed by this revelation. While he had been criticizing his father for being too soft and kind, the old man had been quietly dealing with serious health problems. And while Jake had been mocking Rusty's appearance, the loyal dog had been serving as a life-saving early warning system. I should have known Dad was having health issues, Jake said, guilt washing over him. I should have paid more attention to the signs. Your father did not want to worry you, Margaret replied gently. He told me that you have your own life to live, and he did not want to be a burden. But he was grateful to have Rusty watching out for him. Jake thought about all the times during his visit when he had noticed his father seemed tired or moved slowly. There had been prescription bottles on the counter and a medical alert device on the coffee table. The signs had been there, but Jake had been too focused on his own discomfort to pay attention. Margaret, can I ask you something? Jake said. Where did Rusty come from? How did he end up looking so beat up? Margaret's expression became sad. Rusty was a fighting dog before I rescued him 2 years ago. His previous owners used him for illegal dog fights and treated him terribly. That is why he has all those scars and why part of his tail is missing. When I found him, he was half dead and completely terrified of people. But he seems so gentle now, Jake observed. It took months of patience and kindness to help him trust humans again, Margaret explained. Your father was one of the first people that Rusty felt comfortable around. Robert would talk to him gently over the fence and never made any sudden movements that might scare him. Jake realized that his father's gentle nature, which had always embarrassed Jake, was exactly what had helped heal a damaged and frightened animal. Robert's kindness had earned him the loyalty of a dog who had every reason to distrust and fear people. Rusty may not look like much, Margaret said, but he has the heart of a hero. He has saved your father's life twice now, once directly, and once by alerting us that something was wrong this morning. As Jake absorbed this incredible story, he felt ashamed of every cruel comment he had made about Rusty's appearance. The dog that he had dismissed as ugly and worthless was actually a brave and loyal guardian who had been protecting the most important person in Jake's life. A doctor appeared in the waiting room doorway, looking for Jake. "Mr. Martinez, I have an update on your father's condition." Jake and Margaret both stood up as the doctor approached them in the hospital waiting room. The doctor was a middle-aged woman with short brown hair and a calm, professional manner. Her expression was serious but not grim, which gave Jake a small spark of hope. "Mr. Martinez, your father is stable now," the doctor began. "We were able to restore his heart rhythm, and his vital signs are improving. He is going to need surgery to clear some blocked arteries, but I believe he will make a full recovery." Jake felt his knees go weak with relief. "Can I see him?" "He is still unconscious from the medication, but you can sit with him for a few minutes," the doctor replied. "He should wake up within the next hour or two." After the doctor left, Margaret put a comforting hand on Jake's shoulder. "I am so glad Robert is going to be okay," she said. "He is a strong man, and he has a lot to live for." Jake nodded, but his mind was still processing everything Margaret had told him about Rusty and his father. "Margaret, I need to know more about what happened 3 months ago. Can you tell me exactly how Rusty saved my dad?" Margaret looked around the waiting room and then suggested they sit back down. "It was a Tuesday afternoon in February," she began. "I remember because it was unusually warm for winter, and your father had decided to do some early work in his garden." Jake listened carefully as Margaret continued the story. "Robert was kneeling beside his tomato bed, pulling weeds and checking the soil. I could see him from my kitchen window, and I remember thinking how nice it was that he could get outside after being cooped up all winter." Margaret paused, her eyes becoming distant as she remembered that frightening day. "Around 2 in the afternoon, I heard Rusty barking outside. At first, I thought he was just excited about a squirrel or something normal like that, but the barking continued and got more frantic. It was a sound I had never heard from him before." "What made you realize something was wrong?" Jake asked. "Rusty came to my back door and started scratching at it with his paws," Margaret explained. "He was whining and barking, then he would run a few steps toward your father's yard and come back to me. He kept doing this over and over, like he was trying to get me to follow him." Jake could picture the scene in his mind. The scared dog that he had mocked was actually trying to communicate an emergency to his owner. "I finally understood that Rusty wanted me to come outside with him," Margaret continued. "So I put on my shoes and followed him into the backyard. He ran straight to the fence line and started barking toward your father's property." "Could you see my dad from there?" Jake asked. "At first, no," Margaret replied. "But Rusty kept barking and pointing with his nose toward the garden area. I called out your father's name, and I heard a very weak voice calling back for help." Margaret's voice became emotional as she remembered the frightening discovery. "I climbed over the fence and found your father lying beside his tomato plants. He was conscious but very pale and sweating. He told me he had been trying to get up for over an hour but felt too weak and dizzy. His chest was hurting, and he was scared." Jake felt a chill as he imagined his father lying helpless in his garden, too proud to call his son for help, and too weak to save himself. "I called 911 immediately," Margaret said. "The paramedics arrived within 10 minutes and took Robert to the hospital. The doctors said he had suffered a mild heart attack, but because we found him quickly, there was no permanent damage to his heart. And that is when Dad and Rusty started their morning routine, Jake realized. Yes, Margaret nodded. After your father came home from the hospital, Rusty seemed to understand that Robert needed to be watched carefully. The dog started appearing at the fence every morning, waiting to see that your father was up and moving around. Jake shook his head in amazement. I cannot believe I made fun of that dog. He is a hero, and I treated him like he was worthless. Rusty does not judge people by their appearance or their words, Margaret said kindly. He judges them by their hearts, and despite your harsh comments about him, I think he would still try to help you if you needed it. Before Jake could respond, a nurse appeared and told him that his father was beginning to wake up. Jake thanked Margaret and hurried to Robert's hospital room. Robert was lying in bed with tubes and wires connected to various machines. His eyes were open but unfocused, and he looked very tired and weak. When he saw Jake, he managed a small smile. Jake, Robert whispered, you are still here. Of course I am still here, Dad, Jake replied, taking his father's hand. How are you feeling? Like I got hit by a truck, Robert admitted with a weak laugh. But I am alive, thanks to Rusty. Jake looked at his father with surprise. Dad, you know that Rusty alerted Margaret this morning. Robert nodded slowly. That dog has been watching over me for months. When I did not appear at the window this morning, he knew something was wrong. Margaret told me she heard him barking frantically. Jake felt tears forming in his eyes as he realized how wrong he had been about everything. His father was not weak or foolish for caring about a damaged dog. Robert had recognized the value and loyalty in an animal that others had discarded and abused. Dad, I owe you and Rusty a huge apology, Jake said quietly. I said terrible things about him, and all this time he was protecting you. Robert squeezed his son's hand gently. Rusty does not need an apology, Jake, but maybe you could learn something from him about seeing the good in others, even when they do not look perfect on the outside. As Jake sat beside his father's hospital bed, he thought about the incredible story he had just learned. A dog that had been brutalized and scared by cruel humans had somehow found the courage to trust again, and in return for Robert's kindness, Rusty had become a faithful guardian who had now saved his father's life twice. Jake realized that his father's gentle nature was not a weakness, but a strength that had earned him the loyalty of an extraordinary animal. The ugly dog that Jake had mocked was actually more beautiful than any creature he had ever encountered. Jake spent the next 2 days at the hospital, barely leaving his father's side. Robert's surgery had gone well, and the doctors were pleased with his recovery progress. During the long hours of sitting in the hospital room, Jake had plenty of time to think about everything he had learned about Rusty and his father. On Wednesday afternoon, while Robert was sleeping peacefully, Jake decided to drive back to the house to pick up some clean clothes and his father's reading glasses. As he pulled into the driveway on Maple Street, Jake noticed that the neighborhood looked different to him now. The quiet streets and friendly atmosphere that had seemed boring and pointless just a few days ago now felt peaceful and comforting. Jake parked his motorcycle and walked toward the front door, but something made him stop and look toward Margaret's yard. There, lying under the same oak tree where he had first seen him, was Rusty. The dog looked up when he heard Jake approaching, and their eyes met for the first time without Jake feeling disgust or amusement. Instead of seeing an ugly, damaged animal, Jake now saw the scars as evidence of survival and strength. Rusty's mismatched eyes no longer looked comical but unique and intelligent. The dog's missing tail and limping walk were proof that he had overcome terrible hardships and found the courage to trust humans again. Jake stood at the fence line and looked at Rusty with new understanding. "Hey there, boy," he said softly. "I owe you a big thank you." Rusty tilted his head to one side, studying Jake with curious eyes. The dog seemed to sense that something had changed in the young man's attitude. Slowly, Rusty stood up and walked closer to the fence. "I know I said some mean things about you," Jake continued, feeling foolish for talking to a dog, but needing to express his feelings. "I was wrong about everything. You are not ugly at all. "You are the most beautiful creature I have ever met." Rusty's stubby tail began to wag slightly, and he made a soft whining sound that seemed almost like he was trying to respond to Jake's words. Jake noticed that Margaret was watching from her kitchen window. She came outside and walked over to where Jake was standing by the fence. "How is your father doing?" Margaret asked with genuine concern. "Much better," Jake replied. "The surgery went perfectly, and he should be able to come home in a few days. The doctors said he will make a complete recovery." "That is wonderful news," Margaret said with relief. "Rusty has been restless since Robert went to the hospital. I think he misses their morning routine." Jake looked down at Rusty, who was sitting quietly near the fence, looking up at both humans with attentive eyes. "Margaret, can I ask you something?" Jake said. "How did you know that Rusty would be good with people after everything he had been through?" Margaret smiled and reached down to gently pat Rusty's head. "I did not know for sure," she admitted. "When I first rescued him, he was terrified of everyone and everything. He would not let anyone touch him, and he hid in the corner of my garage for weeks." "What changed?" Jake asked. "Time and patience," Margaret replied. "I would sit near him every day and talk to him gently. I never forced him to come to me or tried to pet him before he was ready. I just let him know that he was safe and loved." Jake thought about his father's gentle approach to life and how it had earned Rusty's trust and loyalty. "Your father was one of the first people that Rusty felt comfortable around," Margaret continued. "Robert would stand by this fence and talk to Rusty in a calm, friendly voice. He never made sudden movements or demanded attention. He just offered friendship and let Rusty decide when he was ready to accept it." "That sounds exactly like my dad," Jake said with a mixture of pride and regret. "I always thought he was too soft, but now I realize he was showing real strength." Margaret nodded knowingly. "It takes more courage to be gentle and kind than it does to be harsh and demanding. Your father understood that Rusty needed patience and respect, not commands and expectations." Jake knelt down next to the fence so that he was at Rusty's eye level. The dog looked at him cautiously, but did not back away. "Rusty, I want to thank you for taking care of my father," Jake said sincerely. "You saved his life twice, and I will never forget that. I am sorry for all the mean things I said about you." As if he understood every word, Rusty moved closer to the fence and gently pressed his nose against the chain link, just inches from Jake's face. For a moment, the tough biker and the scared rescue dog looked directly into each other's eyes, and Jake felt a connection he had never experienced before. "He likes you," Margaret observed with a smile. "Rusty is a good judge of character, and I think he can see that your heart has changed." Jake reached through the fence and gently touched Rusty's nose with his finger. The dog's tail wagged harder, and he made a happy whining sound. "I have learned more about courage and loyalty from this dog in the past few days than I learned in 28 years of trying to be tough," Jake admitted. "Rusty shows me what real strength looks like." Margaret opened her gate and invited Jake into her yard. "Would you like to properly meet him?" she asked. Jake stepped into Margaret's yard, and Rusty approached him slowly but confidently. The dog sniffed Jake's hand, and then, to Jake's amazement, gently licked his fingers. "He remembers kindness," Margaret explained. "Even after all the terrible things that happened to him, Rusty still believes that people can be good." Jake knelt down and carefully petted Rusty's head, being gentle and patient just like his father had taught him through example. The dog leaned into Jake's touch, enjoying the attention and affection. "Thank you, Rusty," Jake whispered. "Thank you for showing me what really matters." 2 weeks later, Jake helped his father walk slowly up the front steps of the house on Maple Street. Robert was moving carefully but steadily, and his color had returned to normal. The doctors had been amazed by his quick recovery and said that finding him so quickly after his heart attack had made all the difference in his healing process. "It feels good to be home," Robert said as Jake unlocked the front door. "I missed my own bed and my morning coffee by the kitchen window." Jake smiled at the mention of the kitchen window. He knew exactly what his father was thinking about. "I think someone else missed your morning routine too, Dad." As if summoned by their conversation, Rusty appeared at the fence line in Margaret's yard. The dog had been waiting patiently for Robert's return, and his excitement was obvious. His stubby tail wagged frantically, and he made happy whining sounds as he saw his friend coming home. Robert's face lit up with joy when he saw Rusty. Despite his recent surgery and ongoing recovery, the old man walked directly to the kitchen window and waved at his faithful guardian. Rusty barked once with happiness and did a little spinning dance that made both Robert and Jake laugh. "He knew you were coming home today," Jake observed. "Margaret said he has been checking the driveway every few hours for the past 3 days." Over the following days, Jake established a new routine of his own. Instead of planning to leave Cedar Falls as quickly as possible, he had called his friend Tommy and explained that he needed to stay with his father for a while longer. Jake had also contacted his employer and arranged to work remotely so that he could remain in the small town indefinitely. Every morning, Jake would join his father in the kitchen for their 8:30 greeting with Rusty. The three of them had developed their own special communication system. Robert would wave from the window, Rusty would bark his happy response, and Jake would give the dog a thumbs-up sign that always made Rusty's tail wag even harder. One sunny Saturday morning, Jake surprised his father by suggesting they invite Margaret and Rusty over for breakfast in the backyard. Robert's eyes filled with tears of happiness at this suggestion, and he immediately called their neighbor to extend the invitation. Margaret brought homemade biscuits and fresh strawberry jam, while Jake cooked scrambled eggs and bacon on his father's outdoor grill. Rusty lay contentedly on a blanket near Robert's chair, occasionally receiving gentle pets and kind words from the old man he had protected so faithfully. "Jake, I have to tell you something," Margaret said as they finished eating. "When you first arrived in town, I was worried about how you would react to learning about Rusty's role in your father's life. But seeing how you have changed and grown has been wonderful to witness." Jake looked down at Rusty, who was now resting his head on Jake's foot in a gesture of complete trust and affection. "I learned that I was judging everything by the wrong standards," Jake admitted. "I thought being tough and looking perfect were the most important things in life. But Rusty taught me that real beauty comes from loyalty, courage, and the willingness to help others." Robert reached over and squeezed his son's shoulder. "I am proud of the man you are becoming, Jake. It takes wisdom to admit when you are wrong and strength to change your heart." Later that afternoon, Jake did something that would have been unthinkable when he first arrived in Cedar Falls. He walked to the local pet store and bought a special collar for Rusty. It was made of soft leather with a brass nameplate that read Rusty, Hero, and Guardian. When Jake presented the collar to Margaret and helped her put it on Rusty, the dog seemed to understand that this was a special honor. He stood proudly while Jake fastened the collar, and his tail wagged constantly throughout the ceremony. "This collar is to thank you for everything you have done for my family," Jake told Rusty seriously. "You are not just a good dog. You are a hero who deserves to be recognized for your bravery and loyalty." Rusty looked up at Jake with his mismatched eyes, and Jake could swear the dog was smiling. The bond between them had grown stronger every day, built on mutual respect and understanding. As summer turned to fall, Jake made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He decided to stay in Cedar Falls permanently. He rented a small apartment just 3 blocks from his father's house and found work at a local motorcycle repair shop. For the first time in his adult life, Jake felt like he belonged somewhere. Every morning, Jake would ride his Harley to his father's house for coffee and their daily greeting with Rusty. The sight of the tough-looking biker waving cheerfully at a scared rescue dog became a familiar and beloved scene in the neighborhood. Children would wave at Jake as he rode by, and other residents began to see him as a protective and caring member of their community. 1 year later, on the anniversary of Robert's heart attack, Jake organized a special celebration in honor of Rusty. The entire neighborhood was invited to a backyard barbecue where Rusty was presented with a certificate naming him Cedar Falls Hero of the Year. Local newspaper reporters came to document the story of the ugly dog who had become a life-saving guardian. As Jake watched Rusty enjoying all the attention and treats from the gathered neighbors, he reflected on how much his life had changed. The dog that he had once mocked as worthless had taught him the most valuable lessons of his life about loyalty, courage, and the true meaning of beauty. Robert, now fully recovered and healthier than he had been in years, sat in his favorite lawn chair watching the celebration with tears of joy in his eyes. His son had not only stayed close to home, but had become the kind of man that any father would be proud to call his own. And Rusty, wearing his hero collar and surrounded by people who loved and appreciated him, had found the happy ending that every rescue animal deserves. The ugly dog with the mismatched eyes and battle scars had proven that heroes come in all shapes and sizes, and that sometimes the most beautiful souls are hidden in the most unexpected packages.